1,
2,
3,
4.
5.
Have you ever wondered what it'd be like to travel back in time? What if I told you you could turn the dial back to the 1800s with a drive to the outskirts of Nashville, Tennessee? You've probably seen the familiar road signs, Old Hickory, and you've probably heard of the Hermitage area if you're from Middle Tennessee. But do you know where those names came from? I did not until I visited the Hermitage this past summer. The Hermitage is an 1,100-acre property once owned by former President Andrew Jackson, and it is still alive today with history. I'll begin by giving you a little bit of information about the famous owner of the home. President Andrew Jackson once owned the Hermitage. He gained his nickname Old Hickory due to how resilient and tough he was on and off the battlefield. Jackson was raised by his mother and his 2 brothers. Sadly, his father passed away 3 weeks before he was born. At age 13, Jackson joined the American Revolutionary War with his 2 older brothers, one of whom died there from a heat stroke. Jackson did survive the war, but he contracted smallpox, which his other brother also died from. By the age of 14, Jackson became an orphan when his mother died from cholera. With his resiliency and determination, Jackson put himself through school. At age 17, Jackson became a school teacher at an affluent school. However, Jackson realized that teaching was not for him, so he decided for a career change and took an apprenticeship with a law firm with intentions of practicing law himself. In Jackson's adult life, he took on even more prominent roles. In 1802, Jackson was elected General of the Tennessee Militia. 10 years later, the War of 1812 came. Jackson earned his nickname Old Hickory from his tough leadership as general. In 1828, Jackson was elected 7th President of the United States and served 2 full terms. Unfortunately, Jackson's misfortunes were far from over. 2 days before his inauguration for his first term, his beloved wife Rachel passed away. She passed away from a heart attack, and it said she had this heart attack due to all the stress over the candidacy of his election. Also, biography.com tells of how Jackson's second term, he survived the first ever presidential assassination attempt. A rogue shooter shot at him, however the gun misfired. The shooter pulled out another gun and shot at him. That gun also misfired. The shooter was captured, and then Jackson proceeded to beat him with his cane. He was a tough man. After Jackson's second term was over, he headed home to the Hermitage for some solitude. Regarding the grounds, Hermitage.com shares the Hermitage is considered by many historians to be the best preserved early U.S. presidential home. The mansion at the Hermitage has welcomed approximately 17 million visitors from around the world since opening as a museum in 1889. The mansion is a beautiful spectacle frozen in time. Initial construction on the original structure began in 1819. In 1834, the mansion faced a massive fire and had to be completely redone, and it was not completed again until 1837. Once inside, you can visit many rooms, one of those rooms being Andrew Jackson's bedroom. In his bedroom, across from his bed, you're able to see his favorite portrait of his wife, Rachel. So when he woke up, the first thing he saw in the morning was her. Also in his room, you were able to see a pair of Andrew Jackson's slippers that he actually wore. The guide told us that the slippers were actually pretty small in size considering to how tall he was. Jackson kept a lot of his mementos in the front parlor, which was another room we were able to visit. He said he's kept these mementos in his front parlor for conversation pieces, and a lot of the visitors that come into the home would be taken straight to the front parlor, just so a little bit of conversation pieces set around. I also think it's some bragging rights for Andrew Jackson. In Jackson's library, you can see all of the newspaper subscriptions that he has. He wanted to keep up with what was going on around the area, so he subscribed to many different newspapers across many different towns. I also like to think that the library is where Jackson made a lot of his really important decisions and had a lot of his deep thinking. The Hermitage was also a plantation, and it was home to over 300 slaves. The workyard behind the mansion was a place in constant motion. Alfred's cabin, named after Alfred Jackson, is the only cabin still standing in the workyard today. You are able to go inside of it, and it's very interesting to see how the slaves lived in what they called home. In the workyard, you were actually also able to see bells that were in place that were used to call the slaves. Each bell had a different tone, so when it was rang, the slaves would know which room they were being called to inside the home. The kitchen is located directly behind the home. In that time, kitchens were actually outside of the home instead of inside, so that the cooking would not make the inside of the house hot. The first hermitage is a log home Jackson and his family lived in before building the mansion. So it was interesting to see how they started and what they moved up to. The 1 acre garden on the side of the property is any plant lover's dream. The garden was one of Rachel and Andrew's favorite places to be. Rachel battled with depression and anxiety, so the garden was a peaceful sanctuary for her. TheHermitage.com shares a quote from Jackson of speaking of his beloved wife. "I never saw anyone more enthusiastically fond of flowers than Rachel." The tomb sites are also located inside the garden. The garden is the only natural place for Rachel to be buried in a beautiful Grecian tomb. After Jackson's death in 1845, he was buried next to Rachel in the tomb. Adjacent to the tombs is a small family cemetery, so it's very interesting to be able to walk around and see the different family members and their names and the dates of birth and the date of death. After Jackson's death, the family came on hard times and sold the estate to the state of Tennessee. The Tennessee Encyclopedia shares in 1888, the General Assembly wanted to turn the property into a home for Confederate veterans. A group of ladies out of Nashville established a charter called the Ladies Hermitage Association to ensure the home was kept the way it was and that the history was preserved. Still today, they are fulfilling this mission. As I was driving away from the Hermitage after my visit, I was utterly amazed at how preserved the property was. From the home, the workyard, the slavery artifacts, the gardens, everything is frozen in time. Andrew Jackson's Hermitage is a must-stop you must add to your list of places to visit. Not only will you leave with a better understanding of the time, but with an appreciation of the knowledge gained from your visit.
1,
2,
3,
4.
5.